Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Pour moi, c'est la première fois que j'avais travaillé en France, parce qu'on discute le evidence-based policy et travaille avec beaucoup de pays d'Europe, mais pour moi, c'est la première fois en France. Et puis, c'est magnifique, les bâtiments et les conversations et tout ce que va passer, j'espère. Okay, maintenant en anglais. I'm going to talk about randomised experiments to test the effectiveness of parenting interventions for children's antisocial behaviour. I'm from the Department of Social Policy and Intervention in Oxford, and we have a Centre for Evidence-Based Intervention in Social Policy and Intervention. And so we do a lot of randomised trials and systematic reviews, and we also have a graduate programme training people in these methods. The same things that Philippe has talked about and others, but applied to social interventions. So we're delighted to maybe develop collaborations over this area. I'm going to talk about why parenting interventions, why might they be important, what are they, and what are some of the key policy questions which we might be able to look at the evidence for from randomised trials. And these are questions such as, what kinds of problems do these interventions work for? What settings could we target? What populations should we target? And is early intervention better? How well does the evidence transport across cultures and countries? The applicability question that lots of people have been asking. And very briefly, are they cost effective? So first of all, why parenting interventions? Well, parenting skills are very strong predictors of good outcomes for children, and there's been many longitudinal and epidemiological studies that have showed that early positive, consistent and supportive parenting predicts lower levels of child antisocial behaviour, lower levels of abuse of children by parents, and enhanced cognitive development. And on the other side, harsh and inconsistent parenting predicts poor outcomes for kids, such as conduct problems, delinquency, drug use, family violence, and poor health and mental health. And these outcomes of poor parenting, the antisocial ones and the other health consequences, are very costly to multiple systems, to every policy system almost. And this has been shown by economic modelling studies, but also is kind of fairly obvious if you think about the cost to the care system, to hospitals, to justice, to schools, and so on. But you might be thinking, aren't there lots of other social factors that contribute to youth problems, particularly poverty, family change, divorce, family violence, and so on? Of course, these are all very important areas for policy response, but how do they link to parenting? Well, parenting seems to be a common pathway or mechanism through which many of these contextual factors impinge on children. And good parenting appears to be able to protect children to increase their resilience in the face of these stresses. I suppose we might think, well, are we just putting a sticking plaster on a much more fundamental structural problem? I suppose that's a debate we could have. But I think if you improve people's mental health and their relationships with their families, then this can empower people in poverty to make other changes in their lives. So it's not necessarily somehow a trivial response to an underlying problem. And then thirdly, thinking about parenting as an intervention, then this combination of parenting as a known early risk factor and one that has, for some very costly outcomes, suggests that this is an important area for early prevention. And preventive parenting interventions seem to work. There's evidence from lots of randomised trials, which I'll come on to. But also quite recently, this evidence has started to get quite widely talked about in global policy guidelines. Just over the last 5 to 8 years or so, these kind of interventions have been recommended by WHO, by UNICEF, by UNODC, US clearinghouses such as Blueprints, the UK government NICE guidelines, for instance, and many other government departments. And there have been quite a lot of economic, both cost-effectiveness studies and cost-benefit modelling studies that suggest that these interventions can be effective. Obviously, these are studies that have to go alongside rigorous randomised trials, as Esther pointed out. So what are parenting interventions? Well, most of the effective interventions are based on social learning theory and attachment theory principles, and these are theories about how parents and children interact together, how they learn good relationships, and how they learn to conflict with each other a lot, and how those patterns can be learnt and then unlearnt. They focus on building positive parenting skills, undoing coercive cycles of conflict, and on reducing parental stress and sometimes in turn parental depression. It's very important that these interventions are based on active learning and practice. They probably don't work when they're just based on information or lecturing at people. Most of the interventions I'm going to talk about take place fairly early in life, between the ages of about 0 and 10, but there are also similar interventions for adolescents. They can be delivered in groups to parents who can support each other, and there are lots of benefits of group-based interventions, but they can equally be delivered to a single family in the home or in a clinic or another setting, and perhaps that has the advantage of being more individualised if it's just one family. They can be delivered universally to all parents, like some of the, I believe you have some kinds of family support interventions in France, which I understand are universal, or they can be targeted at high-risk families or targeted at children who are showing high levels of difficulty. There are many well-known evidence-based brands, if you like, commercially produced programs, which all work on pretty similar principles and tend to be quite high-quality programs with a reasonable evidence base. And some of the names of these programs include the Incredible Years, Triple P, Parent Management Training Oregon, and Strengthening Families. These commercial programs are very costly. So one question that people have been asked, particularly in low and middle income countries, but every country is short of resources, can we make programs that are lower cost, that are more freely available, or can we make programs that are briefer and therefore cheaper, which distill the essential ingredients of these programs? We're working on an initiative with WHO violence prevention called Parenting for Lifelong Health, which aims to develop and test low-cost interventions in developing countries. I'll give you one example of what seems to be quite a high-quality program. It's a commercial American program, and we've done quite a lot of research on this program, as well as on other ones. It's called The Incredible Years. It's a group-based program, and parents go along to a group, usually of about 10 to 12 other parents, fathers and mothers. They go to 12 to 14 two-hour sessions every week. The programs are aimed at kids in the first 2 years of life, and more often in around the ages of about 3 to 8 years. The curriculum for this parenting intervention always begins with building positive relationships. We can represent the program by this pyramid. We pointed it. The pyramids are very important because it's saying the foundation of parent-child relationships is on positive activities and building relationships through play. And it's this that you have to focus on first and most of all before you get on to dealing with misbehaviour. And so the program goes on through rewarding children for good behaviour, learning how to set effective limits on kids and clear expectations to them, and then it gets on at the top to techniques that you might use to deal with what I might call bad behaviour, and these are used much less often and only when really necessary, because more important is the prevention at the bottom of the pyramid. I mentioned before that it's very important that these are collaborative interventions. They begin with the parents' goals and wishes for their child. They take into account the values of the family, which obviously are going to vary from family to family. And parents learn to apply principles of good parenting flexibly to their own family, and they problem solve together as a group. There's a huge emphasis on changing behaviour, not just on discussion or knowledge. It's sort of supposedly well known in public health that increasing knowledge doesn't change behaviour. So the focus is really strong on how are you going to actually change your behaviour? You're going to practice, do role plays, practice with your kid, come back to the group, discuss, practice again, and so on. A real sort of problem-solving, active approach. Although the curriculum is manualised, it's manualised for all these quite complex collaborative behaviours, and it's manualised that the group leaders have to be flexible and culturally sensitive and adaptable. But this flexibility means that it's probably more likely that the intervention will be applicable across cultures and across countries. It was developed in the USA, and it's been tested in randomised trials in multiple European countries, as well as in North America. So how do we know these interventions work? I don't need to tell you why. We've had that beautifully explained. We've also had very well explained what constitutes good evidence for answering a causal question about an intervention effect. So what about the policy questions? So first of all, do these interventions work, and for what outcomes? Well, there are many randomised trials and systematic reviews. Although there are all these commercial programs, there are also many replications by independent teams of most of these commercial programs. These programs were developed in the US and Australia. They've been tested in many European countries. And they show the effectiveness of these early parenting interventions based on social learning theory, both for parents, for improving the relationship with the child, their positive parenting skills, their discipline techniques, but also parent confidence and mental health. And Cochrane reviews have shown that these interventions that target parenting have reasonable effect sizes on parent depression, even though they don't directly address depression. And then for children, these programs reduce children's conduct problems or antisocial behaviour, and some of the interventions suggest they improve other aspects of children's mental health. And they seem to be particularly effective in high-risk children and families. When you give these kinds of programs universally, the effects seem to be much smaller. I mean, whether that's because of lack of power in these universal studies or whether it just doesn't have much effect, I think we're not quite sure. And then similar interventions also help with enhancing early child development. And there's been a lot of work on that in developing countries to try and increase parental stimulation of children and so on, which can increase growth outcomes as well as cognitive development. And then there's similar programs for teenagers. Slightly less clear how effective they are, but some quite good results there. So given all this evidence, it's another no-brainer to me. Why would we want to use parenting interventions without an evidence base? As other people have said, maybe it's not ethical. And it's crazy to me that we would have lower standards in social care and family policy than we have in health care, but that's exactly what we have, very much so, certainly in the UK and other countries I've noticed. Many arguments against using evidence-based interventions. Other people have discussed them better. Obviously, it's a big problem that we have lots of investment in existing interventions of completely unknown effectiveness. And what are we going to do about that as policymakers, as members of the public? And most countries have quite widespread, and many countries across Europe have quite widespread parenting interventions, often universal, not always, of completely unknown effectiveness. They may not have the active ingredients that these tested programs have. They often don't look as if they don't look the same. So what are we going to do about all the existing investment in interventions and all the people's jobs and lives and ideas invested in those interventions? And then the other difficulties, perhaps this evidence won't apply to my city or to my services or my target populations. Now, in what kind of service settings have all these intervention trials been done of parenting interventions? So we get some idea of their applicability. This is a picture of one of our interventions in South Africa, in Cape Town, in families with high levels of AIDS, so families affected by CEDA. And we're doing parenting interventions there where people are very concerned about their children's behaviour problems. But the kinds of service settings these trials have been done in include both universal prevention, high-risk prevention settings, and treatment studies. So, for instance, treatment in child and adolescent mental health services. In various kinds of healthcare settings, such as early health visitor settings. That's a universal service for under fives, where nurses visit families at home in Britain, and these interventions have been embedded with those services sometimes. In mental health services, in schools, in daycare, in social services, particularly in the more costly, severe problems in child protection and foster care, in the voluntary sector, and as you may know, in the UK, there's been a big policy push for the third sector or the NGO sector to provide lots of services for the government. Some people have put parenting interventions into the workplace. It's a good place to find busy parents and to find more fathers. There's a lot of interventions delivered through new media. There's old television, but also the internet, and through texting and so on. So those are kind of simpler, briefer interventions. In Tanzania, we have a parenting intervention embedded in an agribusiness intervention, which are in farming communities. So they're simple farming interventions to do with crop. I don't understand agriculture, but to do with seeds and crops and planting. And so it's embedding the parenting intervention into those groups. And we're doing another one with WHO in the Philippines, where they have a national conditional cash transfer program, and the parenting program is being embedded in the visits that families make to get their cash. But these are just the settings where there have been randomized trials, so it kind of suggests you can do them anywhere. But there must be even more settings where there have been implementation without trials. So how best to target interventions? I think this is an important question about social equality. Do we know if these interventions work as well for families with very high need as for average families? Are there differential effects for different groups? You may have heard of the inverse care law in public health, which is the kind of worry that when you roll out interventions quite widely, it's the people with less problems who will take up those interventions and benefit from them more. So that's an important question. If we roll out these programs more widely, and then they improve the average level of parenting in the population, could they also at the same time increase inequalities if some groups take them up and benefit from them more than others? What methods are we going to use for this question? And then I'll look at some studies about these questions that we've been working on. The kind of questions we've been asking are, for what level of child and family problems do these work best for? So do they work well if you have very high levels of behavioural problems, if you have high levels of depression in the parents, if there's high levels of poverty? Do they work less well or more well? But also, what kind of age of child should we target? We all know the Heckman chart about age effects of different kinds of interventions. And he claims that only early interventions work, and as you get older, they stop working. That's perhaps crudely summarising what he says. And is that the case with parenting interventions, that they work better early? There's a huge policy thrust towards talking about we need to intervene in the first 1,000 days only, and after that, somehow our brains don't learn anymore, which doesn't seem quite right to me. So how are we going to test these questions? Well, typically we conduct moderator analyses, also known as effect modifiers, within randomized trials, and these can examine if the differential or interaction effects for different subgroups, depending on whether they're in the treatment or control group in the intervention. There's lots of problems with these moderator analyses in small trials, that you have low power, It's quite easy to cherry pick the results, as many people have talked about, and lots of confounding which you don't have power to control for properly. So what can we do? We can combine lots of trials into a meta-analysis, but these have huge limitations as well. If we try to look at moderator effects in a meta-analysis, it's fine for main effects, but when it comes to moderators, you're aggregating the client characteristics at a trial level, and you're losing all the variability within the trial. The solution is very close to what the BMJ all trials campaign that I think Philippe talked about, was it? We need transparent data sharing, and then people can reanalyze other people's data, and by pooling it all together into an individual participant level data meta-analysis, then you have much more power to look at these subgroup effects. And there's a whole Cochrane group on this kind of meta-analysis, which is quite exciting. But it fits really well with the wish for more transparency as well. That's what we've been doing, is pooling data from parenting trials across Europe. And what we did was to look at one particular program, which was the Incredible Years program, and to request the data from all the trials of this program in Europe, of which there are, at the time there were 14 trials, there's more now. We were lucky to get the data from everybody because they might not want to. And so this was to ask questions about, are the differential effects for different subgroups? So we pulled the data from 14 trials. There were 7 countries that contributed to these trials. We think it's a complete set of all the trials of this program. The primary aim of these trials and the primary outcome was to reduce child conduct problems. It took a long time to harmonise the data across trials. The data is harmonised at raw item, raw individual and item level. Potentially, it would reduce the kind of outcome reporting bias that the trialists might have already engaged in when they publish the trials, provided they give us all the data. And then we tested for moderator effects using multi-level modelling, and we tested whether the severity of the child's problems, social disadvantage, the age of the child, and ethnicity predicted outcome. Oh, right, okay. So the first question is, do children with higher levels of conduct problems benefit more or less from the intervention? Okay? Question. Plus ou moins? Okay. Well, this plot shows all the 1,800 kids as a little blob. There's a main effect, which is that there are more of the red crosses lower down, and the 2 fitted lines are the predictor effects in the control group and the intervention group. And basically what it shows is that children with higher levels of conduct problems at baseline benefit more from the intervention. So you change more if you have higher levels of problem. It's not just regression to the mean, because you change to a lesser extent in the control group if you have high levels of conduct problems. Okay, what about children in a low-income family? Do you think they'll benefit more or less from the intervention compared to those in high-income families? We might think sometimes we get criticised for making very kind of middle-class interventions or requiring high levels of literacy or highly organised families to do these interventions. Well, the answer was it makes absolutely no difference. The difference between the control group and the intervention group, the magnitude of difference is the same whether you have low income or not low income. So no moderator effect at all. Children in a lone parent family, will they benefit more or less? It might be harder to implement an intervention like that if you're an unsupported parent. Well, absolutely no difference again. We get a P of 0.99, of no difference in the effect size between the lone parents and the not lone parents. What about younger versus older children? We're looking here, of course, most of these trials are concern children between about 2 and 10. So we're looking at age effects within that range. We're not looking at babies or teenagers. I'm going to show age as a continuous variable. Obviously, the policy thrust for early intervention is huge. The part of Heckman's curve, we're looking at quite a steep part of Heckman's curve. We're looking at 2 to 10. We're looking at this period and saying, is there any age effect borne out in the way suggested by this mixture of interventions here, but in this case, just looking at one intervention. Well, no, completely flat line of age effects. The intervention is every bit as effective whether you're 2 at the one end or 10 at the other. The majority of the kids are between about 3 and 8. That's where the cloud is thickest. So not even a hint of an age effect, which I think is very interesting. And if you think of all the neuroscience saying, oh, children's brains are only malleable when they're little and they won't learn, it really doesn't fit at all with that. Okay. And then the final question, will all this evidence transport from the places where the trials have been done to our culture, our country, our city, or whatever? First of all, think about children in ethnic minority families. Will they benefit more or less from parenting interventions? There's very little evidence about this from Europe. There's quite a lot from the US. So again, our pooled data study was quite nice for this. Most of the trials with the ethnic minority kids were trials from the UK and from the Netherlands. The other countries didn't have many, which were in Scandinavia and Portugal and so on, didn't have many ethnic minority families. But again, no evidence of any interaction between the treatment effect and being in an ethnic minority or not. Equally strong effects in ethnic minority and majority, which is quite impressive. And some US trials have found the same. And then do they transport across countries? So the applicability question that other people have raised. We did a recent, did a systematic review and meta-analysis. We found evidence-based parenting interventions that have been developed in one country and then transported and trialled again in a new country. And we found the effect sizes were just as high as they were in the origin countries. But surprisingly, it didn't seem to depend on the country context. The effect sizes were not related to how similar the countries were to the origin country in their cultural values, their resources or their family policy regimes. And these were the countries we looked at in admittedly quite a small meta-analysis. So it's surprising that programs developed in Australia seem to work just as well in Hong Kong or Iran, and so on, North American programs to Europe, and so on. Okay, so conclusions. Parenting interventions work. They seem to be cost-effective. I think well-powered moderator studies suggest the effects are strongest for kids with high levels of behavioural problems, conduct problems, but I think it's an encouraging message that the effects seem to be equally strong for disadvantaged families and for those from ethnic minorities. And we didn't find any age effects, and that's not in keeping with the huge focus from neuroscience and policy on early intervention. The evidence from multiple countries and cultures suggests these interventions can transport well, even though we all think parenting is different everywhere. The interventions seem to be able to address this. And the wide range of settings and delivery methods for these interventions means that potentially policymakers, families, new countries could choose from amongst the many versions or delivery methods of these interventions what best fits their services and their cultural context. I haven't talked about the challenges. We don't know much about the long-term effects. Scaling up these in a very widespread way is challenging, and there are rare examples of this. We need to know how best to slim down the interventions so they'll be cheaper, and how to combine with other social problems that also need targeting, not to do lots of different things for problems in the same families. So how can we improve early child development, reduce family violence, and so on? Thank you.
You have very nicely shown that the parenting work is efficient in many different situations, culturally, economically, and so on. Are you able, from your study, to pinpoint what is universal, in a sense, in the core of what is being applied to reach such transnational, transcultural, trans-economic success?
I don't know. I think one of the things at the core is that parents in different countries seem to say quite similar things about what they want from their children. They say quite similar things about what they want. They want their children to behave well, to respect them. In some cultures, people want their children to be happy, and others maybe less focus on that. And so I think there's a motivator about wanting to get on well with your children, to enjoy them, not have conflict, and not have problem behaviour. That's quite motivating for these interventions for everybody. And then they're teaching strategies that show success, that take into account the family's wishes for the child, and then which gets them success fairly quickly. Maybe that's why they work. But I think they're universal. There are a lot of universals about what people want for their kids, even though some of the details are different in different countries. And they want to get on with them well, and we don't realise how badly we behave with our children sometimes. And, you know, they need to have people, we all need to have a think about that and how to make it better.
Just a small question. You compared the parents from the income, but is it only the income or the type of micro-society in which they live? Because you may have people who are not rich, but live in a micro-society in which, for example, honor or things like this are very important, and people, and that.
Yes, I mean, obviously we can't, in these trials, we can't divide up the predictor effects much more finely because we don't have the data, but also we might not have power, so can't actually answer that question. But I mean, you might expect there would be ethnicity effects, but there weren't, and that's from very, very diverse populations in Amsterdam, Birmingham, London. We're not picking up ethnicity effects. So, I mean, it's hard to answer, but I don't know how we can go on cutting up the predictors, but it's possible, yes.
Jacques?
I have two short questions about your Incredible Years program. The first question is, do you have any rough estimate of the size of the staff, of the cost of the costing of the program?
Right.
And the second question is, you have 14 or 15 RCTs in 7 countries. Don't think that France is there.
No.
Do you have some? Why? My question is why? Do you have some contact with social scientists in France? No. Or do you have any explanation for that? No?
Right. Okay. I'll try the first question first.
That was just to know.
I don't read papers in my field. I'm a child psychologist working in parenting and conduct problems, and I don't read papers about the theory or the intervention trials for these subjects in France. So therefore I don't find people to come and talk to, I guess. And more generally, when we're doing systematic reviews, I don't come across studies from France, and our searches would find studies from France, I think. Obviously, I don't read French journals, but our searching should find everything. So I assume that there's not many people working in this field in France, but I might be wrong. Be good to find out.
The budget?
When?
The budget of the
what?
study, the cost of the study, the cost of the study, the cost of the. The cost of have you an estimate of the cost of the 15 hours?
Oh, the cost question. Yeah, I thought you meant why is France? I thought you meant to do with France. In the costing study in the Welsh trial, it was about £1,000 per child. Now that's for kids with were mostly with young children with mostly clinical levels of conduct problems. So they're potentially quite costly children in the future.
So it's like 2 million. 2 million, like 2 million. You have 2,000 children. It's like 2 million.
Oh, if it was 2,000, yes, yeah. That was the cost in 2005 as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Frances.